Hello, and welcome to What Now, a video interview series presented by Michigan Future, a nonpartisan think tank devoted to catalyzing prosperity in Michigan. I'm Sarah Sherpicki, the host of What Now and the vice president at Michigan Future. What Now is inspired by the way that the global coronavirus pandemic is shining a spotlight on urgent issues in our economy and our communities. We're using this time and these interviews to ask, in areas where something wasn't quite working before the pandemic and is almost certainly not working perfectly during it, what can we do? What can we learn during this time that should help us recover as a healthier, more successful, more prosperous state? In our first series, we're focusing on education. It's an issue that has been at the heart of Michigan Future's work for a long time, and where a couple of decades of education reform have left Michigan schools far behind, especially for students of color and for non-affluent students. So how do we redesign our schools to help our children and our communities prepare for the world that awaits us over the rest of the 21st century? Today, we're talking with two leaders of a small district near Grand Rapids called Godfrey-Lee. You may have already watched our interview with David Britton, who retired as superintendent from Godfrey-Lee a few years ago. David helped to ignite a change in the district with the adoption of the 6 C's, a set of skills that are critical to success as the framework for learning in the district. The 6 C's are communication, collaboration, content, critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. The superintendent today, Kevin Polston, and Assistant Superintendent Carol Lautenbach are joining us to talk about how they've continued down the path of a really remarkable transformation that is empowering all of the people in their district, and that puts the 6 C's at the center of learning. We are glad to sort of consider them friends and to be talking with them here today. Welcome to you both.
Thank you,
Sarah.
So I want to start a little bit with just like kind of one of the big questions. And Kevin, I'll ask you to sort of start with this one, which is to think a little bit about the purpose of education. I know that you guys actually released a new mission statement a couple of years ago that you put a lot of thought into. And I feel like the purpose of education is something we think we might all agree on, but is worth like articulating. What do we believe there? Could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question. And I think it's important that we keep our why and our core of what we do front and center. And for us, we see education as the means to transform lives, communities, and just our world. And so if a student graduates, or when they graduate from Godfrey-Lee Public Schools, we expect their diploma to be their passport to the world to live out their hopes and dreams. And so that means they have to have the skills, knowledge, competencies that whatever they choose their path, whether it's post-secondary training, whether it's a 4-year institution, or the world of work as an entrepreneur or whatever, that they have the skills that they can go ahead and be successful in that way. We know that in our district and in many, that our families have tremendous value of education for the opportunity that it presents. And the United States is unique in the world. It's the only place where every student, regardless of ability or disability, really has that opportunity to transform their life. And while there are some inequities in our structure and our system is flawed, which we must continue to work at so that opportunity exists for each and every child, the progress is there, it's measurable. And what the 6 C's have done for us is really looked at it in a broader construct so that when our students do leave us, it's not just measured on an SAT or some sort of standardized test. It's those broader basic skills, which we know that our universities, our workplaces, and our individuals, as far as being more joyful, really appreciate. And so, the purpose of education for us is be you, be connected, be brilliant, that we want every individual to be who they are. We want them to be connected to each other, connected to the world around them. We believe brilliance is innate, and it's our job to bring that out in each and every individual that calls our school district home.
That's great. So Carol, David told me when I talked to him that you were the one who I think first read Becoming Brilliant, which is the book that sort of lays out this framework of the 6 C's. And to anyone watching, we've also interviewed one of the co-authors, Kathy, so you can find her interview as well. So can you tell us a little bit about when you read it, like what convinced you that this was a framework like you wanted to bring to your district?
Yes, so That actually happened after we had done some design thinking here in the district and had discovered from interviews with students and community partners, parents, educators, what their vision of education was and what it was that our mission really needed to be. And what we heard from over and over again from every sector was that students wanted more than just content knowledge. They wanted to become who they were meant to be, and they wanted their skills, their interests, their passions in the curriculum of the school day. So we started just exploring what was out there that gave frameworks that might be helpful to us as we began to think about how do we actualize a vision like that. And of course, as soon as I turned to the matrix, the 6C matrix, I thought, here's what we've been looking for, because the matrix also includes content, and not all do. Sometimes 21st century skills, as they're often called, are put next to content as something in addition to content, or for some students, or if I get to those, we'll get to those 21st century skills. But this matrix, which is built on 10,000 points of research, said these 6 C's are all part of what it takes to be ready for the world that kids are part of today. And that's true whether they're 5 years old or they're 15 years old. It's not all about preparing for the future. It really is about meeting a child's emotional and academic, civic needs in the moment.
Mm-hmm. So if we want to really make this visible for people, what it means to be putting the 6 C's at the center of your district, maybe it makes the most sense to actually talk about a classroom. I think most of us just think about education, like the education that we went through, 30 or 40 years ago. So how would this feel different to students, or maybe if parents were looking at a 6 C's classroom, what looks different? How does it feel?
It can look different in different contexts. I'll give you I'll give you 3 examples. So one at the senior level right now for us is something we call the capstone experience. And that's an opportunity for students to bring together all of their interests into a culminating project where they're not just digging into the research about something they're interested in, they're also communicating that through all of the other C's as well, and bringing not only their school learning together, but also the learning that they do outside of school and the interests that they have outside of school together into a culminating project. Mm-hmm. That would be one example. Another example would be through thematic instruction. So often, especially in high needs districts, you may see instruction that's very I'll say piecemeal, where you do a lot of skill building without a broader context. And we found thematic instruction to be a way in which students make sense out of content and are also able to get up into the higher levels of the other C's as they use a theme to organize the learning that they're doing in ways that help students make sense. Mm-hmm. And then the third, I would say, is a STEAM approach, mm-hmm. where students are learning the principles of engineering, which is a design principles, and using those to create and collaborate and innovate in ways that may not even reflect many of the state standards, but certainly include many of the C's.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So can you talk just a little bit more about thematic learning in particular? Does that mean that the math and science teacher are talking to each other and co-preparing lesson plans, or what does it mean on the ground?
So a good way to start with this mindset is to think about learning as not in these separate silos, independent of one another. As we look at just children that are prior school age, they don't learn math, they don't learn language, they don't learn science, they they learn those in an integrated manner. So we know that the brain makes meaning and makes sense based on context and through, whether it's sensory or, multi-dimensions. And if we take that same application and put it in a school context, you may start with a question about something, say, what problem do you want to solve? And if you have a student that says maybe in Michigan, water quality issues are, front and center. Sure. And so we've had units because we have a creek that runs alongside industrial centers that goes right through our district. Water quality has been a significant issue. So what are the different lenses you could look at water quality through? You can certainly look at it from a scientific lens, and you could analyze the organisms in the water or the degree of purity based on what compounds or chemicals you may find in it. You may look at it from a social studies lens with the policies that govern how we protect our waterways. You may look at it from an advocacy perspective, and you may write a paper or do some research on it to generate ideas. And then you could look at it from an empirical mathematical perspective and look at what are the ratios or formulas that we need to look at when we're doing measurements for our water system. And statistics in many ways has many more applications than just traditional math. And you could apply that same line of thinking all the way from kindergarten throughout. You could make art out of it. You could finger paint and create what the visual imagery that's in a student's mind. And so all you're doing is trying to have multiple modes, multiple constructs for students to make meaning from their learning around a common topic. So there's all sorts of different topics. If you want to look at conflict, if you want to look at power, if you wanted to look at something as current as civic engagement, there are many ways in which we could unpack broad universal themes in multiple contexts, multiple contents.
So what does this mean sort of as in your roles as sort of administrators trying to help teachers? Like I understand you don't just flip a switch and say, teachers, now you do it this way. So what do they need in terms of support, permission, barrier reduction? How do you think about helping teachers get there?
So if you look at our traditional measures of student performance and, the whole reform movement, that's probably, let's say in the last 20 years, certainly NCLB amplified that. But if we look at the measures at which we thought we could say for school quality, and we look at content, really heavy standardized tests, and just because we can measure it doesn't mean we measure it very well. And so when you look at the two most significant predictors of student performance on those measures, it is economic status and racial identification. And so if you can, with a high degree of certainty, predict performance based on race and socioeconomic status, then we're really not measuring the content, very well. So if our target is to incrementally improve towards a standard that doesn't measure what we wanted it to, then frankly, what's the point of continuing to refine that? It's a broken system that we shouldn't try to put more energy behind, because more energy is going to have a diminishing return. So rather, let's look at a broader construct of how we measure. And just because things are harder to measure, like collaboration, communication, creativity, just because they're harder to measure doesn't mean that we shouldn't try or look at the research around it. And by no means are we saying that we shouldn't value content learning. What we're saying is when we do these other 5 C's, it strengthens our content learning because now we have meaning and context around it. And so the first thing we have to do is give permission for teachers that are traditionally trained, who also went through the same traditional school system, to say, let's try different. Let's look at things differently. Because if we just try to incrementally improve what we're doing, we're not going to get there anyway. You're going to get frustrated. Your students are going to get frustrated, and it's not going to get us where we want to go. But also, along with the 6 C's, we have to look at how innovation intersects with equity. And so how do our students' identity play a role in their learning? So if we were to do that same water quality lesson that I was talking about, and we were going to look at the beach, that's not going to be very relevant to our kids, because while some of our kids have gone to the beach, there's not a beach that's close that most of our students have engaged in. If you talk about Plaster Creek Well, they know where that is. They can go see it. It's relevant to their lives. And so you have to build multiple approaches and multiple entry points along this continuum. And what we strive for is it's an equity lever for us, but it's also one to make relevance and meaning so that our students' identity can be manifested in the classroom so learning can make more sense to them.
Mm-hmm. I want to just put part of a sort of fine point, because this really made a lot of sense to me. I kind of imagine the brain almost like Velcro. And if you use another piece of Velcro when you're trying to learn something, if it has a way to stick to something you already have in there, like that just makes it more effective. And I feel like that's part of what you're saying. So I did want to ask a little bit about, especially today, sort of how you as a district are approaching equity. I know your district includes a large number of kids who are children of immigrants and English language learners, and it's not an affluent district. So how, especially in the last 6 months, have you been thinking about your approach to building equity?
Kevin mentioned innovation and equity in the same sentence, and I think he may have coined this phrase. Equity requires innovation. Now, we can't keep going the way we've been going and expect that those incremental changes or incremental improvements are going to close the opportunity gap that we know exists. So, if I can just back up to when we adopted the 6 C's, it wasn't because we were looking for a new way to make school more exciting. Mm-hmm. It was really because our results were not where we wanted them to be. They weren't where our students wanted them to be, and they weren't where our parents wanted them to be. So we looked at the 6 C's as an equity lever and a way to bring a new approach to school that would provide opportunity to all students. Mm-hmm. So I would say over the last 6 months, when we entered this pandemic era, we were overt about saying we were not going to approach learning as a loss of learning. And that sounds counterintuitive, because students were certainly not given as many opportunities to learn at the end of the school year last year as this year. But if you conceptualize it as a loss of learning, you're always going to be remediating. You're always going to be trying to fill something that didn't happen, rather than looking at what are the opportunities to learn now that we could continue learning, continue to help kids move forward, and still provide opportunities to find time to work on the unfinished learning that happened. It's a conceptual difference. And, again, I'll go back to thematic instruction as just such a natural way to allow multiple entry points, multiple pieces of Velcro. We call that assimilation or accommodation. The information has to be assimilated or accommodated when it enters. And the more we can assimilate it, the quicker the learning becomes meaningful to us. Yeah. So we have a number of partnerships. And one of them we're launching tomorrow for our K-5 remote teachers. We have 10 teachers who are learning remotely. It's a partnership with Michigan State University. Mm-hmm. And the organizing principle for that will be thematic instruction. Mm. So because the teachers are saying we have even less time with each of our students. So how can we make this work? And one of the teachers said, well, I think, that thematic instruction that we were doing previously, I think we can adapt that in this new context. So thematic instruction, and, I'll just mention too that Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Galinkoff have helped us with a research project. And maybe Kathy has mentioned that in her interview as well, where the case study that we did showed greater gains in math and reading, greater retention over the summer, greater satisfaction from teachers, and better behavior from students in our K2 case study that we did. So very promising approach for learning here in Godfrey-Lee.
Mhm. So, could you talk a little bit more? I did want to ask about that study and about sort of what was the research question? You know, like what was the actual intervention that you were studying?
Yeah, so it was the effect of thematic instruction on achievement, on attitude toward learning, teacher satisfaction, and retention of learning over summer learning loss. I guess is what you would say.
Mhm.
And in all cases, it does appear that students who were taught in using a thematic approach all had either less loss or more gain than their comparable peers in our system.
So I really wanted to ask a little bit too about how in the in the spring or in the fall. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you guys are right now in terms of like how the district is operating amidst the pandemic? And Kevin, I'll switch back to you.
It's November 5th, and uh, been in-person learning since September 8th, and we started with our elementary students, and then the following week we added middle school, and the week after that we added high school, and we've been in person, since then. During that time, we have had to have right now our high school, due to a number of staff being in quarantine, we've had to shift our high school to virtual learning because subs are impossible to find right now. The district hired several floating subs to make sure we have enough staff, and we still don't have enough. And so we've done a lot of innovative practices to stay open during the COVID pandemic, and I'll give you some examples. We have strictly cohorted our K-8 students, so they only have interactions with those students in their class. Our middle school students, we've altered our schedule, so they go straight through from about 7:50 to 1:20, and they get lunch on the way out the door. So we don't have like a cafeteria setting. Our high school students eat lunch in the classroom, as do our K-5 students. We've partitioned our playground, and so kids in an elementary classroom only play with the kids in their classroom. They don't mix with other kids. We've had to make some difficult decisions, we're the state's smallest geographic district, 1.4 square miles. And so we canceled transportation of general ed students to and from school, but we initiated then a walking school bus. And so where we have district staff that has bus stops still, but they walk to school. And our longest route there is about 0.9 miles. And that's, a healthy way to get to school, but it's also safer because we know the virus transmits at a higher rate in closed, confined spaces. And so we've had to think differently with our high school schedule. Instead of having 6 classes a day, we've cut that down to 3. And they're in there for a longer amount of time because we know if we can limit the amount of students they have engaged with over the course of the day, we're going to limit the spread of the virus. One thing I'm quite proud of is we partnered with the Kent County Health Department and Arctic Medical Laboratories in Grand Rapids to be what I believe is the first school in Michigan to have on-site COVID testing. And it's using a saliva test for a PCR test. So it's a highly reliable, sensitive test, and we get results within 24 hours. And so we administer the test on site. It's very non-invasive because it's just collecting a saliva sample. No swabs in the nose or brain scratches, what it looks like. It's very straightforward. And we've had several community partners come alongside, and we're grateful for the philanthropic community. And our partnerships within the Kent County area. For instance, the Kent County Board of Commissioners has allocated $3 million of CARES money to the local school districts we've been a recipient of. And so we have a full-time nurse to make sure our healthcare needs are met. We have healthcare paraprofessionals in each building to make sure that we can support our students, but so we can keep the focus on learning in the classroom. I can probably keep going, but the amount of focus we've had to keep our core mission moving through all of the challenges of the pandemic is something I'm quite proud of. And I believe that in many ways, the innovation that we've had can serve us well as we think about, all right, we've innovated now because we had to. Now what's innovation look like because we want to?
Yeah.
And how do we segue?
Well, it's interesting. I like you read my mind. I wanted to ask about innovation because so you've had to innovate during the pandemic, but you guys were innovating before also. So, and I don't know, it wouldn't quite be fair, but when we look at to say innovation is sort of not always found in educational environments, but it is a system that has been really slow to change. So how do you think you have built that culture that I would probably suggest has now served you well in the pandemic when innovation was really required? You guys have some practice. Like how have you done that?
So I'd say one of the things we've done is really adopted a system-wide approach. I'd say in our early days of innovation, it was more, if you're ready to innovate, innovate away. If you're not ready to innovate, that's okay too. You know, when you're ready, let us know, and we'll be ready to help you innovate. And now I'd say we're more aligned around the mission that you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, and that's helped us with goal setting in the district, so that everyone is aligned in goal setting, so that we're all working toward a more innovative. And again, I think that equity requires innovation. I think we don't innovate to innovate. We innovate because our students need a more equitable approach to education. So we're always going back to the system that we set up and measuring and aligning with the vision and values that we have as a district. So that's sort of a broad overview, not a very specific way to answer your question. I'd say as we make hiring decisions too, I'd say we've gotten better and better at looking for those qualities in educators. The 60 learner profile isn't just for student learners. We look at every person who comes into our district as a learner as well. And how can we look for folks who are, willing to be at those higher levels in the 60s themselves, willing to take a risk, willing to collaborate, willing to solve hard problems.
So again, I think I start with a why. And we spent a full year building a strategic design around a very clear why and our core values. So our core values are community, human-centered, equity, excellence, and relationships. And so everything we do is built around those core values. And so from those core values, you then examine our practices and how are we doing? Are we getting closer to achieving those values, or is it putting us further away? And so when you have a standard or you have a target that you're moving towards, it gives you some leverage to get a little bit closer. We've, again, through partnerships, we've had great resources to try and practice, different ideas. When you think about education, so let me give you an example. Pharmaceuticals, when they start research and development on a drug, it takes them, about 7 to 10 years to get to market. And so you go through lots of trials, you go through lots of different iterations to get to the finished product. Well, in education, our R&D is our students, and it takes about 13 years to get through our process. But how much are we really being iterative in our thinking with how we evolve our system, or are we just putting the same machine to work? And so the outcomes that we have are very reflective of the system we have. And to change, there has to be a greater desire to change than resistance. And so you have to have a clear and compelling why, the way things have to be different. And I think you got to be very careful as well. Our educators are extremely passionate, they're dedicated, and they care deeply about what they do. And you got to be careful that you're not pointing a finger of blame, that just because we're not getting to where we wanted to doesn't mean that the individual in the system is flawed. It means the system as a whole is flawed. And so we have to then reform that at an individual level and a systemic level. You can't just do one without the other. And that's not always easy.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Could you talk a little bit about how you guys do teacher evaluation in your district that is maybe a little different from many of the schools in the state?
Well, again, through education reform, teacher evaluation was one of those. And so the state has a standardized tool that, districts have to use. So we use that. However, the district does have autonomy in how student growth is measured. There is 20% of a teacher's evaluation that has to come from state growth measures when they exist. And then the district can choose how it wants to measure another 20%. So a teacher's evaluation has to have 40% of it make up of student growth, half of that from state data and half of that from locally determined. So what do we value here? We value a broad definition of learning. We value the 6 C's. Mm-hmm. And so we've created a structure for teachers to implement 6C learning, have measurement of the learning that occurs during that experience, and then that counts as that growth measure. And at this time, because we're still exploring, we're still engaging, we want the stakes to be low so people are genuine and really trying, because the product isn't what we're looking for. We're really looking at the process right now. And so it's self-monitored, it's self-evaluated, and for sure we are engaged as administration in it. But the pieces of the puzzle that we have autonomy and authority over, we've really tried to tightly align to our values.
Yeah. Well, what also has occurred to me as you were talking about the need for innovation and how hard it can be is it is less risky for the adults in the system to just keep doing what is expected, right? And so you have to be willing to take some risks to make the kind of changes that you're talking about.
That's on the 6C framework, by the way, under confidence.
No. So let's talk a little bit about some of the learning that has happened in the, and maybe just because so many people are in remote learning, and I know you guys are getting to do a lot of in-person learning. Are there some wins from the remote learning sort of environment that you've had to do that are worth sharing that parents or educators might really be interested in? And I guess by wins, I mean where you feel like you're still teaching the skills that you care about and sort of not just providing something that students complete in return.
Yeah, I would go back to this partnership with Michigan State University that we're launching again tomorrow, and then it will be a five units that teachers will be studying, and everything that they'll be learning will be transferable to whatever format they teach in the future. So I think the skills that they learn about looking at unfinished learning, aligning their standards in a way that come under an umbrella of a theme with experiences and ways to help students connect with culturally responsive practices. It really will be an opportunity for them to do that in a cohort with some amazing community partners helping them that will we wouldn't have had that opportunity without this remote learning stake in the ground that really shifted the need to and the urgency to find a different way of doing things, because it's very clear you can't just take your in-person classroom and put that online and teach students that way. So I think that's been a hidden opportunity that will pay great benefits for all of our remote teachers, no matter what format they end up in the future.
Mm-hmm. So what does that look like for the kids? Like what will their experience of it be?
It will be more project focused. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the teachers are asking for is, how do I assess learning in a virtual environment? Mm-hmm. When you're used to doing that side by side with elementary students, or with the help even of maybe some paraprofessionals or specialists, how do I assess learning in an environment where those kinds of resources may be less available or not quite as immediate? Yeah. And one way of doing that is through very authentic projects.
Mm.
And one of the things we'll be doing through this partnership is helping them develop authentic ways of measuring learning. Again, something that we've been working on for years, but right now there's such a demand for it because there's such an urgency to see, you know, how is this student really responding to the instruction that I'm giving?
Mm-hmm.
How are they receiving that and then responding to it in a way that I can see and experience.
Yeah.
So to me, that's a very exciting part of the partnership that we're starting on Monday.
Yeah. So I feel like it's been a point people have made that in the remote environment, it's really easy. The kids can vote more powerfully with their feet, right? They can just not show up or turn off their cameras or whatever. And so, so if we're being smart, we're learning about what keeps them engaged.
Right.
Kevin, I'll ask you, are there other things that you hope we, sort of not just your district, but as a community, that we can be learning right now from how this whole, like, what should we be studying? What should we be keeping our eye on to make education, you know, what it should be for kids?
I think one of the things we found is, and we've been fortunate, we're fully one-to-one, and you know, any student that's needed internet access through a partnership with Comcast, we're able to get that for them.
That's great.
But I think one of the things we learned is, you know, technology is a tool to support learning. It is not a panacea of, you know, the future of education.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tool to support learning, and that's been a reality that we've had to experience. And you know, I don't think we can forget that learning is a communal event, and in most cases, it's done collaboratively. You know, it's one of our C's. There is a percentage of the population that learns better independently and self-guided. I certainly understand that, and having options for those students is of value. But we made a very clear distinction early on that God-freely students will be taught by God-freely teachers using God-freely curriculum. We didn't outsource it. We didn't use any of the platforms that are out there, or we didn't say it's going to be, you know, asynchronous. I think what we found, though, is there are immense challenges and immense obstacles to navigate for a child learning at home. And what we also uncovered is that while we value our parents as, I'll say, partners or even co-educators, not sure that our resources or actions aligned with that. And so we added additional resources to support that our parents, because there's all sorts of, you know, barriers, especially in a population that, you know, maybe refugee or immigrant, or, you know, have native languages other than English. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting that need. So I'd say a good learning for our system was technology certainly plays a role. We got to grow our competencies, but it's not replacing. Another piece of it was that we have to make sure that we are engaging our parents, because kids spend on a regular school year 80% of their time outside of school, yet learning still occurs. Now, many or 50% of our district chose to be virtual. That means 50% of our kids are 100% at home. Yeah. And so how do our resources and personnel reflect that value that our parents are co-educators, our parents are valued partners in this process? And we've made some ground there, but I think we still got some to go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Carol, are there other ways you would answer the question, things that you think like we really should be learning something right now as a community about how to educate kids? Is there anything you'd add?
Especially about a virtual environment, or?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about things that this moment provides us the opportunity to look at, but that actually could apply when the pandemic is over, you know?
Yeah, so whether we're in a virtual or in-person environment, I think something that we certainly should be paying close attention to is student voice and choice. Right now, you know, as you mentioned, students can vote with their on-off button. They can vote with their, you know, showing up to a Zoom meeting or not showing up to that Zoom meeting, or even showing up or participating or not. You know, we've lost all of the, or many of the structures of a traditional classroom. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to connect with students in a different way. And again, using design thinking, build up from an empathetic viewpoint. What is it that would motivate and engage you in this learning path? We do surveys and that sort of thing, but it's really more than that. It really is connecting with, as Kevin said when we started this, what are your hopes and dreams, and how can this time in history and in your life contribute positively to those hopes and dreams that you have. And we've started as a district with some social emotional learning that we're doing to make sure that we're staying close to that part of a student's life, and really making sure that we're checking in with them on how they are feeling about where they are in the world right now, and then taking that to the next level. How can the learning you're doing help contribute to your well-being?
So did you find that you had to let go of anything that kind of would have been a priority this year otherwise? Or, I mean, I think it was so interesting. You said at the beginning, you chose not to frame it as a loss of learning, but to just say, what can we learn now and how can we learn now? But was there anything you had to just release?
Yeah, so many things have just shifted, I'd say. I don't know if we had to really abandon, but some things that were a priority are not as much of a priority. I think our main priority now is really what was the unfinished learning, and how do we weave that through, rather than stopping the train and saying, we're going to do the second half of second grade now while you're a third grader. The train will never catch up.
Right.
And nor is that the point. You know, this really is an opportunity to say, what is the most important? And we say all 6 C's are the most important. So within the content realm, what is the most critical for future and current learning? So I'd say we've accelerated the importance of that. I wouldn't say that we've abandoned other things, but I'd say that has risen to the top of what we're doing with our teams.
Yeah. Kevin, what about for you? Is there anything that you felt like I just have to deprioritize this?
Always prioritize safety. And so, you know, I give a ton of credit to our teachers and staff. You know, from the get-go of planning, you know, we said we're letting go of, you know, kids eating lunch in the cafeteria. You know, we're letting go of kids going to their specials classroom to go learn. So I think, and if you were to just take those examples, I mean, that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is the structure of school can adapt when it needs to.
Can be flexible.
Right. When we want it to. And so when we think about the levers that drive school, you know, and school schedule and how it works, we really open up some opportunities. Now it's, once we get through this, and that can't come soon enough, I might add, you know, then are we still looking at that blank canvas? And I think what we have to protect in education is entities rushing in to fill it. And I'll be blunt. You know, there are entities that can't wait to measure what our students don't have. And there are some fulfilling reasons they want to do that as it relates to their mission as an organization and the influence they want to have on public education. And I think we need to resist those entities influencing what happens in schools. And I think we need to start with a different premise about what we value in education. And we have to believe that our children are whole human beings that bring their identity and their experiences with them every day. And we have to value that and how we can shape our environment around them instead of forcing them to conform themselves around us.
That's very powerful. Do you feel comfortable being more specific about what type of entities you're talking about? Like,
there's all sorts of advocacy, you know, entities that have an interest, and some are well intentioned. You know, and there's some that are that are great partners in equity work, that are trying to make sure that equity stays at the forefront. But then what are the actions that come from it that are used to achieve equity? And I'll just give examples from the past. And we are, on the precipice of a new, president. And that, the new president is going to bring in a new Secretary of Education. But if you were to compare, the past 3 secretaries of education, or at least, under the last 3 administrations, what has really been done to change the landscape of education, whether if you want to look at NCLB or Race to the Top or ESSA or whatever we're in right now, in the charter movement, there's been nothing that has transformed outcomes. I mean, kids are doing similarly on measures as they did before. And so I would argue there's actually been harm done, because, when you looked at a survey from 2019 that was conducted in Michigan, where 75% of the educators wouldn't recommend the profession to someone else. We've robbed this profession of its value by trying to instill all of these accountability and reform measures when we know what research says about how children learn. Yet, because it's difficult to measure, and because it's difficult to monitor, and because there's mistrust in the system, we've kept it at arm's length instead of embracing our educators with the esteem that they deserve and the value that they provide our society. We've treated them as less than. And guess what? Our outcomes are less than, our talent pool is less than, and our systems are less than. And in particular, our urban schools have been disproportionately impacted because our policies and practices target those entities, through resourcing, funding, staffing, et cetera. So, if you want me to keep going, we can keep going on this, but our system start with a why if we're going to change it.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's really interesting that you centered the difference in approach is on treating the students as though they are just full of deficit versus treating them as whole humans, and that who should be well served by this system and who deserve that. And sort of starting with those 2 different origin points, it feels like it makes a real difference. Do you want to elaborate on that a little? Yeah,
I'll add on to that. In this state, 2% of those that hold teaching certificates are African American. About 3% are Latinx. Yet we know by 2045 that this state will be made up by a majority of persons of color. So if we really want our schools to be representative of the communities we serve, we better make some intentional efforts to make sure that our educators reflect those demographics, because we cannot replace the lived experiences of individuals and the impact they have on our classrooms. And so if we are really going to wrap ourselves around our children, then we better have some commonality with those that we're serving. And again, I'm not pointing a finger. I'm not pointing a finger of blame. I believe everyone is well-intentioned. I believe everyone's doing everything they can right now. Our system is broken.
So I would like both of you to answer this, but we'll start with Kevin to just build off of this. But what would you hope as a state, how do we use this crisis? What's the opportunity here? Like, what should we be doing to turn things around on the other side, to make it different?
Well, one of the things we found in the spring is parents quickly realized being a teacher isn't as easy as we thought it was. And, it didn't take long for students to start getting suspended from home. And so we had this paradigm where, again, you had 75% of educators say they wouldn't recommend the profession because of the culture and the status that teachers had. And then through the pandemic, we found a new construct of how we value educators. So if we truly value education as the most transformative system we have for our communities, our culture, our economy, then do our budgets, do our actions, do our priorities align with that? I think that's the greatest takeaway that we can have, is that we have underfunded, we've undersourced, and we've undervalued education for decades, and yet we're surprised at the outcomes.
Yeah. Carol, what about you? How do you imagine a different possibility on the other side of this? Not just in your district, but for the system in the state?
So 2 things that the state did abandon at the end of last year were teacher evaluation and student assessment. And the world did not stop. Nobody, lost their life. Things went on. And it relieved a lot of pressure, obviously, for teachers and likely for students too. So, we can hope that there's some acknowledgement that those 2 systems have not brought about what they were intended to bring about. They brought about probably more compliance and more probably less risk-taking and innovation and equity and more of the same old system that doesn't serve students well in both cases. So my hope would be that those systems would be examined for what they are. They're accountability systems, but accountability to who? They're not accountability to the values that Kevin led this session with, to the well-being of every child and the uniqueness and brilliance that each one brings here to the district, nor the uniqueness and brilliance that our teachers bring. So those would be my hopes, that we would have a fresh look at the relational part of what teaching and learning requires, and those systems work against those.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you talking with me today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate you guys being a partner.
We'd love to hear from you about how to make Michigan's education system work better for all kids. Please find us on social media.